David, you believe that God has a divine plan that we read in the Bible for human history and for the Jewish people. If that's the case, how then can individuals have free will?
What you've touched on here is a biblical question. You know, it's one of the few philosophical questions, I think, that the Bible actually, I think, raises. There's the famous story of Joseph, you know, which was put on as a Broadway play and so forth. People know the songs. They may not know the story as well as the songs. The story is that Joseph was despised by his brothers. They were very jealous of him because he was a favorite of his father. And they threw him in the pit, and he was taken out of the pit, and eventually he winds up in jail, but he's able to interpret in Egypt. Right, he's in Egypt, and he interprets a dream of someone who had been among Pharaoh's officers, I guess you can call it. Then Pharaoh has a dream, and he needs somebody to interpret it. Then Joseph comes, interprets the dream, and before you know it, Joseph interprets the dream so well that he becomes the viceroy of Egypt. Then the plot continues. Joseph is in charge of bringing food, during a famine. And his brothers come down to Egypt, and they don't recognize him, and the story goes on in this way. Now, all of this was part of a divine plan. Divine plan was to get the Jewish people to come down to Egypt for whatever reasons God wanted them in Egypt. So you have to ask yourself, did the brothers choose freely? Now, Joseph's position was, oddly, that it was not the brothers who brought him down, but he says it was God. So don't worry about what you did. This was
the brothers were feeling terrible that they had sold him, left him for dead.
Yeah, or at least they regretted it on a practical, on a sort of practical level. So, who is the one person who, in that context, says that the brothers did not act freely? It's Joseph. Joseph says to them, "Don't get upset. It's not you who sold me here, who brought me here. It's really God." So he sees, in his view, the brothers really weren't acting freely. God is the one who brought them down. So in Joseph's view, it wasn't really the brothers' choice to throw him in the pit. It actually was part of this divine plan. But a lot of the thinkers who deal with this episode deal with it differently. In their view, here's the way God works. God knows what free choices people will make. And he sort of sets up little incidents that point things in the right direction. In the Joseph case, what happened is Jacob sent the father of these people sent Joseph to find his brothers. And along the way, Joseph meets this mysterious figure who is just called a man. And the sort of obvious way to interpret that is God placed that man there to tell him where his brothers were, so that the whole event can ensue. But still, all the choices that the brothers made were free choices. The expression that's used to denote this approach is harbei shiluchin lamakom. What this approach suggests is that God sets up little coincidences, and then within the framework of those coincidences, people make choices that feed into the plan.
So they're still having free will in these each one of these circumstances, and if we extrapolate, one could say that if one little plan didn't work, God would have another one.
Exactly. If the brothers had made a different choice, so then it would have happened some other way. Now, I suppose that if it didn't happen, that anybody, was going to do something that would bring them down to Egypt, then maybe God would have sort of coerced that result. But until then, he's letting people exercise their free will in the service of the plan and setting up little coincidences. And you have this in the book of Esther too, but I'm not going to elaborate on that right now. So I think then ultimately the point is this. People do exercise their free will. God manipulates the world in such a way that as a result of their choices, ultimately, the divine plan will be fulfilled. And let me just quote to you one last thing about this. There is a view that Israel, in fact, it seems to be the accepted view, that Israel will not be redeemed until they repent. And the question comes up, well, what if they don't repent? After all, it's their free choice. And we're told that God will then place upon them a king who will do a lot of harsh things to them. And that ultimately will make them repent. So at the very end, God might very well accomplish his plan actually by, in a sense, depriving people of free will and coercing them to the conclusion.